quarterback window versus the zero RB dream zone. That is what we're going to talk about today on RotoViz Overtime. We're going to look about the players going in that area and how to balance out your draft to try and get that perfect combination on your roster for, of course, those zero RB drafts that you're trying to get the running backs to add that firepower to, but also trying to get a quarterback or potentially those two quarterbacks in the quarterback window. Shawn, we are looking forward to this show. Should be a fun topic, but kicking things off, we haven't recorded it's not a live show, but a show with me and you over the last week, because last week's show was some of the drafts that we did against the RotoViz Overtime listeners, which we really enjoyed doing there. Happy to share some very positive feedback on the thoughts of those drafts. So Shawn, as we kick off this episode, didn't get to talk to you on the 4th of July, so happy 4th of July to all our listeners and to Shawn as well. But how are you getting ready for this another week closer to the NFL season? This is where my ongoing joke about the closeness to the NFL season will really start to ramp up.
Yeah, it's a fun time. I just mentioned on the Best Ball Banana Stand this morning that this is the perfect time for really deepening your research and understanding the teams, understanding the player profiles before we start to get a bunch of news that's going to move ADPs. And you're thinking, okay, well, the news is relevant. I want to react to that. But in order to react properly, to react to the correct degree, you have to truly understand these guys and where you think they should be before you start to factor some of those things in. So this is the perfect time of the year, Colm. For me, it's one of the most fun times of the year because you can relax a little bit and do that deep research. We'll have stuff here on the show. I have a lot of articles getting ready to come out on the site. Ben and I have done some fun shows and we'll continue to do some fun shows working through some projection related things that bring up interesting questions, debates, thoughts about how you can use individual player intel to kind of tweak or to perfect your tactics. All of those things are a lot of fun right now before we kind of get into the whirlwind. Now, the whirlwind can end up being very misleading for you at the same time that you have to understand or have to know how depth charts are moving so you can adjust properly. So the whirlwind isn't all bad, but it certainly is going to be pressurized in some interesting ways. Right now, we want to understand players, teams, and tactics. And Colm, we're going to combine a couple of those things for the show today. The MFL 10 of Death, number 11, is a little bit in the rear view at this point, but we wanted to talk about sort of the second half of that draft, what I did to build out the running back position after only taking one running back in the first 11 rounds. And then also look at that as it relates to the FFPC board currently in the Best Ball Tournament there. Certainly if you're starting to consider playing in their Fantasy Pros tournament, the 350 level, it has the $1 million prize. If you're starting to look ahead to the main event, this is also going to be relevant for some of those thoughts. But Colm, we have this interesting dynamic that is kind of ramped up in 2024 where you want to get that wide receiver build. Michael Dubner has had two fantastic articles out recently. The first one helping you understand zero RB or wide receiver heavy, however you want to look at it, but drafting a lot of receivers and why that works in the current ADP landscape. And then number two, the second one, Be the Avalanche, explains, the number of detours that you can take, which isn't very many, right? You need to be drafting receivers. Blair has a fantastic article out on the site from the last week looking at bully tight end and how taking a couple of the elite tight ends can really supercharge your build. Well, if you do that, then obviously the picks that are going to be battling for that second tier status and are going to overlap in ADP will be the quarterbacks and the running backs. And Colm, we want to start by sort of looking at this from a QB perspective, the QB window. One of the things that I did in the MFL 10 of Death was bypass running backs in rounds 10 and 11 to take Jordan Love and Caleb Williams. Obviously, when you do that, you lose out on running backs that you could have selected. Let's build out the picture for the listeners. What is the QB window? And then we'll dive into running backs. And we're going to give you some zero RB picks today that will form the basis of the plan for 2024. And then it'll give us a sense too, again, this baseline to help us calibrate who are we targeting now. And then we look at this in a month, who are we targeting then? We look at it a couple days before the season starts, who are we targeting at that point, and understand some of those shifts at this all-important position and the specific range at this all-important position.
Yeah, so the quarterback window, and this is something that, I mentioned to Shawn before the show, sometimes we talk about a topic like this and then the question comes in, what is the quarterback window? And we've discussed the whole show without actually saying what it is. But anytime I always do this call out to the listeners, if there is a phrase or something that we use that we may just have skirted over, always reach out. We'll be happy to, add it into a show as we move forward to discuss it further. But you mentioned, Dubner's part. I really enjoy the phrase, be the avalanche. That sounds like something that Bruce Lee would have said back in the day, Shawn, I think, in terms of trying to have a nice, flow state mindset. But when we look at the draft boards overall this year, you mentioned about how those pieces can go together for like a bully tight end build or a zero RB build, whichever way you're trying to play it out. But with that, then I think this year is quite interesting with how the draft board sets up. And I am going to share this up on the screen here for anyone watching on the video side. But we have the ADP here from the last week or so in the FFPC Best Ball Tournament. And when we look through it and how things are playing out with the wide receiver position, the running back position, and then this being tight end premium, those elite tight ends getting pulled up. The elite quarterbacks are there, but which kind of feeds a little bit interesting, Shawn. Round 5, there's no quarterbacks going off the board there. But when we go from around 6 through 12, there's, in that range, we get quarterback 6 all the way through quarterback 20, and that zone all the way down to Deshaun Watson. The quarterback window kind of can slightly shuffle from year to year, but it is that area where a lot of, I guess, people might perceive even as QB2s, but you have the likes of Joe Burrow going there, Anthony Richardson, Kyler Murray, but below that elite tier. And I think, in previous years, if we go back 10 years, a lot of the quarterbacks would have been pulled up to the very top, but then they all dropped down to this level. Now we're seeing a split from that top tier. But when you look through it, for me, it kind of would be that round 7 range through round 12. And it also fits that's kind of the zero RB range when we're looking at the players we want to target there. So they both kind of pair together from that perspective, which fits in for this conversation today, because it's a one versus the other. It's this versus that. Which player are you taking in that particular round to build it out? So I would be setting it really at the 7 through 12. But when we look at this particular board that we have shown today, people may say that Stroud and Richardson could go into it. I feel like it is beyond them. And realistically, if I was setting it up as we would have talked about it a couple of years back, it would really be in the 8 through 12 range, where you would be looking to get 2 of those quarterbacks in these best ball formats in particular to set up that roster. But Shawn, is there anything further on the quarterback window itself? I think people are aware of the zero RB range and where people are looking to take the specific running backs after having passed on them for the wide receivers and the elite tight end and those opening 6-7 rounds. Would you have any other differences to that quarterback window?
Yeah, and one of the things you want to understand is every individual year is going to give you different QB pricing. So you're going to be moving things up, down a little bit to take advantage of or to reflect the pricing in your year. One of the things that we saw last season was that because the wide receiver heavy teams were so dominant, it did help you to then have a couple of the QB window teams or selections, as opposed to, burning one of your picks for an elite quarterback. And one of the things then that happens is that you have a reaction. It's easy to say, it's hard to do, to kind of avoid the overreaction or avoid the trend from the previous season at certain positions. I think QB is one where you always, at least to this point, if you could have forced yourself to avoid the trends, you're mostly going to win. So if you can be a little bit contrarian at QB, if you can go for the QB1, QB2, those elite guys, when they get pushed down, that can work for you. When they get pushed up, you want to take advantage of these sort of middle pricing. But from a big picture perspective, you are going to be looking for those quarterbacks in the window who are most likely to give you upside and who are most likely to fit with other things you want to do from a team perspective. And so I'm going to suggest that the QB window is usually in that QB 9 to sort of QB 17 to 20 range. Whether it stops at QB 17 or stretches a little bit further is going to depend on the depth that the NFL has at the position in any given year. And then for individual drafters, it's going to depend on your board. If they're a priority target and they're simply cheaper, you want to take advantage of that as opposed to avoid them. But one of the things I mentioned a lot last year when we had a couple of QBs that we liked late is that you do want to have humility and understand that the reason that they're being priced this way is the community is saying the scenarios that actually would work are very unlikely. And then you look at that through the lens of history, and history is also telling you that these guys who are priced that way have generally not hit. You also want to understand where your incentives are in different formats, because if you can find those guys in Superflex, if you can find backups who end up being starters in Superflex, it gives you a lot of additional leverage that doesn't exactly play out in the same way in the regular format. So you need to understand your format. You need to understand the pricing. But Colm, I'm going to suggest that the QB window is from Dak Prescott there at QB 9 to Justin Herbert at QB 17. It is interesting because QB 22, Aaron Rodgers with a Garrett Wilson. If Wilson does what we expect and they get any production from a Mike Williams, from Malachi Corley, from Tyler Conklin, from Breece Hall, who's going to catch a ton of passes, it'll be difficult for Aaron Rodgers to not pay off. You do have some injury risk. The thing that happened in the MFL 10 of death is that Jordan Love, who is here in the middle of round 8, fell to me at the end of round 10. The running backs who were available at that point, the next two guys who were selected were Trey Benson and Gus Edwards. Neither of those two players right now looks like a very strong pick. It doesn't mean that we might not get more information. Benson might move up the depth chart. Edwards might prove to be healthier than it currently looks like, and he might separate from the two guys behind him. Obviously, he's priced as though there's some likelihood to that. I was going through my exposures, and I have a stunning number of teams that have either Vidal or J.K. Dobbins on them. I'm betting pretty heavily in the other direction.
How many of those have Gus Edwards, and is it above or below 1?
It is below 1.
Okay.
Which again, I mean, that can come back to bite you if you're wrong. But when you're looking at the prices and you're looking at the scenarios, the other guys have more upside and they're a lot cheaper. So I think you just have to be skewed that way, even if you end up being wrong. So you look at that, Love falls, he's an obvious pick. Caleb Williams is there as we wrap back around. And one of the things that I was gambling with in this league was the idea that because of the way analysts tend to draft, the QB window is going to be very compressed, right? So we even get CJ Stroud and Joe Burrow in round 9, which feels pretty crazy. And yet, as we work back through it, Geno Smith, QB 17, goes off before my next pick. QB 18, Justin Herbert, who I would argue is in the window, goes just barely after that. So I don't know that you're going to have the window shifted down by the same number of picks if the QBs don't go early. So that's something to think about kind of across different formats, but may have some different incentives. You have to understand your league, understand the likelihood that drafters are going to need to have the good QB2. One of the things that you tend to see in expert leagues that are pure redraft. So if you're already in redraft mindset, often the QB2s just won't be drafted at all. And so in those leagues, they'll just continue to plummet. But when you have best ball formats like this, even when the top guys fall or the kind of Richardson, Stroud, Burrow, Daniels range, even when those guys slide a little bit, I still think you're going to have that back end of the QB window in about the same place, because so many drafters are going to feel they need to have the players in place at that point of the draft. So Colm, that's what we're looking at for the QB window. Again, you can check out the roster construction tools and see just how dominant this was last year. One of the reasons I point to this is that back in the MFL 10 days, the QB window was extremely dominant. And so we think about more than just a couple of seasons that we've seen recently. Again, very strong reason to believe that this element where you're getting the cheapest guys who still have a very high floor and have access to spike weeks are going to be the players that you probably want. And we think through them, how does it work? Obviously, Dak Prescott with a CeeDee Lamb. Jordan Love has a number of outs. You have Caleb Williams with those 3 receivers. You have Trevor Lawrence with a couple of interesting names, especially perhaps Brian Thomas and Evan Ingram. Purdy and Goff are actually a little bit surprising that they go where they are because they have so many players that can be paired with them. I think it's difficult to not be on the 49ers and Lions early when you know that you have high-scoring quarterbacks and at the very least high-floor quarterbacks who are so cheap to get. It makes your construction easier to put together. And then obviously you have Tua with both Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. You think through some of those things, even in the first 5-6 rounds, how am I drafting receivers to get access to these specific quarterbacks as opposed to putting together a team where, I needed Josh Allen or I needed Hurts or I needed Mahomes. Now I don't have those guys. Now my options are players who are being drafted really late that I don't want. So that's a second level thing to think about as you're deliberating on your QB window selections.
Yeah, that's all very well said. And when we look at the QB window as well, Shawn, you mentioned the tools, but when we talked about QB window for many years, for long-time listeners, they'll know that we talked about getting 2 quarterbacks in the window. You mentioned then, last year we kind of had a lot of targets, so we like those late guys. And it doesn't mean, while I haven't been drafting many of those elite guys this season, it's not a case that I wouldn't be willing to do that if, they come past ADP, for example. But the QB window has been something that we've targeted for a long, long time, as you mentioned, all the way back to the MFL 10 days. Is it still a case that you're trying to get 2 of these guys on those rosters, for people who haven't been familiar with the quarterback window in the past?
Yeah, and especially if you get a couple of guys toward the end of the window so that your overall expenditure is in check, you can look for a third quarterback late if you have a specific name that you really like. If you think that Daniel Jones is going to play the whole season, then the mix with his rushing, especially his rushing as he gets healthier as the season moves along, with having a Malik Neighbors, that would obviously be an interesting name for you. I would mention that Derek Carr has been, or specifically in 2023, was a better deep passer than really seems, quite intuitive. He's got a lot of deep threats at the receiver position. That's something that Ben and I talked about last week on Stealing Bananas. You can check that show out if you're interested in the New Orleans Saints. Obviously, we think that Bo Nix has a shot. When you are a rookie QB going in and starting from the get-go, you have a very, very wide range of outcomes. And so the pricing reflects that. You want to understand the downside as well. You don't want to go in with Bo Nix thinking, this is a lock to, carry everything for me. You have to understand that it's a balance there. And Justin Fields, still a name that when you're talking about tournament winning upside, he is more exciting than some of the other guys in that area. The downside, obviously, is that it's just a complete hole in your roster that he doesn't play at all this season. But getting the 2 does a lot for you because it gives you 2 good players, and you're going to have them constructed with the early receiver picks to make that roster really powerful when you are correct. But then, Colm, we balance that with wanting to take advantage of these wonderful running back prices. I mentioned Trey Benson and Gus Edwards as the 2 guys who were kind of in direct conflict in the MFL 10 of death, we do get some slightly different names who are in conflict as we work through the QB window here on FFPC. Benson is the running back 33. He goes just ahead of Jared Goff, Caleb Williams, and Trevor Lawrence. If you want to take Purdy, you're going to have to take him, or in mini drafts. Obviously, we're talking about average draft position, not guarantees in any specific league, but you're going to take him right ahead of Tyjae Spears. The next guys there, though, Brian Robinson, Austin Eckler, a couple of Washington backs. I don't know how much they appeal to me. There are some very strong structural reasons that running back scoring out of Washington will be difficult. And then you also don't know which guy. Colm, for me, one of the
you got to get Brian Robinson on your roster, Shawn. You got to get him on it.
This team feels more like one that will be balanced in a way that gives you no value from either player. Now,
it can be limited.
Injuries can change that in a heartbeat, but it's very problematic, I think, when you look at where they are. When you have a guy like a Javonte Williams going after, who could be an absolute league winner, when you have a Devin Singletary who could get almost all the work for the Giants going after, and even I would say when you have a Blake Corum who, his most likely outcome is that he scores probably dramatically fewer points than Brian Robinson. But if Kyron Williams goes down, Blake Corum explodes. If Austin Eckler goes down, Brian Robinson is still probably just an okay player for you. Again, it's not because we're necessarily selling Brian Robinson. He was a priority target a year ago, and he paid off a lot of what we saw in his profile that made him that. But you have to understand where the guy goes next. You can't chase the previous season's production if the profile and the offense doesn't suggest that secondary breakout is extremely likely. It's not that it couldn't happen. But then you look at Chase Brown, another name that goes after Jerome Ford, who could be the starting running back for the majority of the season for the Browns. We wrap back around. You get Gus Edwards, you get Nick Chubb, you get Ezekiel Elliott, you get Zach Charbonnet. How are you looking at this 9 through 11 range at running back versus the quarterbacks who are available there as well?
Yeah, so I think this is the part that gets it very interesting, because I've talked a lot as well, and we're not going to do this on today's show, but the two tight ends and what Blair has talked about in this recent article. But if you don't get two of those tight ends, and we ran into the Shawn in the listener league, although that was in Superflex, with this range being the kind of Pat Firemouth, Cole Kmet, Luke Musgrave range, let's say. And when you don't have those elite tight ends, it starts to make these areas a little bit even trickier to navigate, because you're trying to add that piece as well, which can make it challenging. When we look at the running backs versus the quarterbacks, there's obviously a certain amount of these players then that we are not targeting, and there's other players then that are priority targets to get on your roster. Similarly with these particular quarterbacks. And that's where the conversation really, boils down to the players that you want. And when you went through the names for the 0 RB kind of zone there, and I'm going to go from the Dak Prescott pick. So at this point, it's Dak Prescott, Jordan Love, or Jaden Daniels. And the players for running backs that are going there are Najee Harris, Jalen Warren, Raheem Mostert, and Zach Moss. Two of the players I have been trying to get from that 0 RB group the most on my rosters where possible is Warren and Mostert. And again, it's tricky for me if I have gone through those opening 7 rounds without a running back to take one of those quarterbacks over the running backs, unless it's, let's say, a CeeDee Lamb team and you want to get Dak Prescott along with him. But in that particular round, I'm much more likely to go with the running back selection. And the next round, then, that's only Brock Purdy going off the board. So I'm going to pair these two rounds together with Brock Purdy to Trevor Lawrence, Caleb Williams, and Jared Goff. Out of those particular quarterbacks, the quarterbacks I'm drafting most out of those are Goff and Tua. And again, you mentioned with the options that are available earlier, you can kind of see how your drafts progress and whether it's a Hill or a Waddle roster, or if you have some of those Lions on, and you can kind of do that quite nicely. The same with Williams if you have those Bears. So this is an area where I kind of prefer to take one of those, or to take two of them even if possible. I still do like Brian Robinson, even though Shawn mightn't be as much on board. But you've Tajay Spears then as a running back. You've Colm, who Shawn mentioned. You've Chase Brown, Jerome Ford, Devin Singletary, Javonte Williams. So again, another very rich place for those running back targets to go through. But I would prefer to get one quarterback out of that tier along with one of those running backs rather than the previous tier. So round 8, I do find very hard. Round 10 is kind of where I'm more likely to go towards quarterback. And really, when I'm trying to play that, I'm trying to see which of those potentially drops into the following round, which is round 11, because it's the round where I find it much flatter and much more difficult to, really want to dive to click that button on the other positions outside of quarterback. And, that's the round that Justin Herbert goes in, but I'm kind of looking to see if you have a Fallen Goff, for example, into that range. That's where Kendry Miller goes, Marshawn Lloyd, both players that I like drafting. If it's not a team that would have a Kenneth Walker, I think Charbonnet is very interesting. Shawn, I'm getting more and more interested by these Nick Chubb recovery videos that I'm seeing online. Nick Chubb seems to be, pardon the pun, in the best shape of his life coming back from this injury. But as I said, if you have got your tight ends, I think that's the round there at the back of round 10 into round 11, depending on which quarterbacks make it through, is my preference for the second quarterback option. Round 11, I'm finding quite, although we like Kendry Miller, we like Marshawn Lloyd, much flatter compared to those other 3 rounds. And if I had to pick my 2 favorite rounds for the running back targets, it would be round 8 and round 10. So that round 9, round 11 range are probably where I'm looking to get those quarterbacks and pick those guys up. Any players there that I mentioned outside of Brian Robinson that you have a different opinion on? Any of those guys in terms of the 0 RB names that you would, definitely under no circumstances be taking one of those quarterbacks over?
Well, the very first thing I want to mention as we kind of put together a global look at this is that the wide receivers in round 7 and 8 are much more compelling in FFPC than they might be in some other formats. And so having the receivers in 7 and 8 is going to arguably take you out of the market for the really strong names at running back in round 6, which would be Kenneth Walker, Aaron Jones, Ramondre Stevenson. I think all 3 of those players can be an anchor running back for you in round 6. And yet, because you still have a lot of guys like Keenan Allen, Jaden Reed, McConkey, if you want to have a few shares there, but Xavier Worthy, Rashee Rice, Deontay Johnson, and then in round 8, at the back of round 8, Jordan Addison and Jackson Smith and Jigba, because a lot of the receivers who actually have the best breakout profiles are very palatably priced. FFPC is a format where I'm very willing to go to a Bijan Robinson, a Breece Hall, a Jonathan Taylor, a Kyron Williams, a Devon Achane, and perhaps even a Travis Etienne early, right? You're not as out on those profiles when you can get those receivers a little bit later. And so that changes the mix a tad bit in that those names in round 7 and say Jonathan Brooks, running back 24, the end of round 7, extremely compelling player, probably not necessary in this format. We move into that Warren, Mostert, Zach Moss range. I really like those guys. I think that you have to pick them ahead of the quarterbacks much of the time. And you probably want to create some exposure to Jordan Love and Jaden Daniels, especially. Daniels is coming off just after Addison and JSN. It's after Mostert and Warren. So even that's sort of the front end of what we're talking about today as being potentially the QB window. I think Jaden Daniels in FFPC is a slam dunk selection, in part because that entire next round of running backs you can pass on. Now, I really like Tajay Spears there, but you can pass on him. You don't have to have him when Tony Pollard is also there and the offense will probably be bad. This is an example of a situation where Spears is probably the most electric player on that roster, but how does an offense function if your top guy is the number 2 running back, right? It's hard to have your RB2 be the driver of an electric team, and so it probably won't be. We want to keep that in mind for him. The tricky part, and I think the part that's so fun for 2024, is you have all of these great running back prices, but you are going to hit tiers. You are going to get to a point where you go from potentially having a lot of starting upside to then a lot of contingent upside. And I think that tier break is probably at the running back 35 point here, where Javonte Williams, Devin Singletary, probably starters. Now, Javonte Williams especially is a starter who's at huge risk. But if he starts, then the upside for him is to absolutely smash where he's going there. As we think back through to, what the mix of trade-offs was in the MFL 10 of death, he goes at running back 33, which is about the same price. And he goes before my pick in round 10. So Jordan Love comes back to me, but that running back tier of Javonte Williams and Devin Singletary, those two guys go off. So I don't have that option. So I take a couple of the QB window picks. And that's the way that I think you should be considering it in most circumstances. Is you're going to build out your tiers. You're going to understand where you think the profiles switch. And if you have tiers that include different styles of profile, you can target the end of that as opposed to the beginning of that. And so then what I mean is we look back here again at the FFPC ADP, and we see this group of incredibly compelling backups / committee guys. Colm is probably overvalued, and yet because the upside is so severe, he's going there. Chase Brown, undervalued, probably has standalone value. If he ends up as the starter, he's going to annihilate that price. Charbonnet, a contingent play, but extreme upside. Lloyd, the same thing. Miller, the same thing. And so you're getting that profile in round 11. But then the interesting thing is as we move through, you get a little bit of that in Dowdle and Chandler, but you get a lot of it there in round 13 with McLaughlin, Wright, Vidal, Dobbins. Hubbard is a little bit tricky because, there might be competition for that backup spot and the offense might be bad. But then we move back around to a Tyler Allgeier, huge contingent upside. Ray Davis probably has standalone value.
Who do you think is the most contingent? Is Allgeier the most contingent upside, do you think, this season based on their price?
I think so. And, maybe what we got from him as a rookie is a little bit misleading, but I would suggest that what you saw last year is probably the misleading element when we think back to what he was as a college player as well. And really a guy who doesn't have tons and tons of reps at the running back position still. You look at that team, you look at that offense, and what you would expect a running back who consolidated the work to score. And it's one of the reasons that Robinson is valued so high, in addition to obviously the talent, right? But to put Bijan, who hasn't quite proved it in the same way, in that same price range with Breece Hall, who looks like 5 years from now, we could be talking about as one of the greatest running backs of all time, and who has a profile where you would expect him to have a lot of rushing value and a lot of receiving value in an offense where if Aaron Rodgers stays healthy, the offense should be explosive. I mean, again, with Bijan, structurally, you're arguing for huge upside to have him anywhere in the same range because Breece Hall has demonstrated what Robinson hasn't quite yet. Now, he could in 2024, and I think a lot of that is baked in, and I would bet that he jumps close. But, I mean, Breece Hall, you're talking about David Johnson, Le'Veon Bell, but with long speed. You're talking about a mix of Jonathan Taylor and David Johnson, right? It's only in this new era of ADP that wouldn't be in consideration for the 101, and maybe not with Christian McCaffrey, with what his scoring profile was last year. We talked about how much he gapped the running back position, but Breece Hall as the 102, you can easily justify that. So a little bit of a digression there to talk about those very top guys, but as it relates to Allgeier, massive amounts of contingent upside. The concern that I would have is that most of the rest of these players we do think have standalone value. There might not be a ton of that for Allgeier. You look in round 15, Bucky Irving, probably standalone, a lot of contingent value. Once we get beyond that, it's a little bit thinner, but Braylon Allen at running back 58, similar to the situation with Allgeier going down. I mean, you really hate to imagine that with either of those top players, but Allen maybe provides that same basic premise a couple of rounds later. So the thing that we're looking at here is once we move into the scenario-based range, how much difference is there between the guys in round 10 and the guys in rounds 15 and 16? Certainly, I think in 15 and 16, you've got to be a lot pickier in terms of the names you're actually drafting. And yet, when you're building a team out to get individual scenarios, you don't have to have that scenario hit for every single player in order for the build to work. Now, you're going to have different incentives for redraft and for best ball. With redraft, obviously, you're going to be able to replace a lot of guys. You're going to be able to pick and choose those weeks where a specific running back appears to have the full workload. With the best ball, you have the benefit of getting the spike weeks, getting the touchdowns that maybe you couldn't predict, and then having the chaos move some of those guys to the front for you. But Colm, in this MFL 10 of death, I get the Mostert pick. I only have one running back through 11, but then I end up with McLaughlin, Kendre Miller, Ray Davis, Bucky Irving, and then deep at running back 61 and 62, I get Roschon Johnson and Will Shipley. Two players I actually thought might go earlier. I considered taking an additional back there in Isaac Guerendo in round 20. If almost anyone other than Devontae Walker had fallen to me at the 2011, I would have taken Guerendo. And you can look at that there and ask yourself, is this the type of running back room that I feel comfortable with? If I can build this without spending at running back, would I prefer to do that most of the time, much of the time, a third of the time? And so you can be very intentional with the teams that you build based on how comfortable you feel with this type of group. For me, Colm, I like the fact that you get a player in Mostert who is an established veteran with elite speed in an extremely high scoring offense. Is there collapse risk? Is there injury risk? Yes. But then you move down and you have three players here with second-year breakout upside in McLaughlin, Miller, and Roschon Johnson. And then you have three rookies in Davis, Irving, and Shipley. I also like that balance as opposed to, say, 6-0. When you go 3-3, you're picking from pockets of slightly different profile, which gives you slightly different risk reward. I don't think that we want entirely the unseen or the unknown in the rookies. That's taking on too much risk, but with the risk comes some additional upside. Colm, I think the profiles for McLaughlin, for Miller, and then, Roschon obviously goes much later because it's that like backup committee. Anytime that you are in a backup committee,
2A and a 2B.
Right. That part is problematic, but I do think you want to create exposure to Roschon with the possibility that Herbert gets moved or simply pushed to the side on this particular team. Roschon is a high value touch guy. And so if you have a player who catches passes and could be the goal line back, even in a three-way, you're looking at him there at running back 61 and saying, I have to have some exposure. When I took these defenses, and most listeners are not going to have to deal with defenses in their leagues, but when I took the defenses to potentially save a roster spot, give me an initial pick in 20, one of the things I was looking at there is what is the difference between the guys who will go in 16 and 17 versus the guys who will go in 18 and 19. And then after I made my pick in round 17, I'm sort of, draft board watching the whole way because Roschon is the player I would have picked. And for him to come back through for only one running back to go in that range, that validated the approach. And, obviously part of that is luck, but it's wonderful that it works out that way. And again, that's something as drafters we want to think through. What are the scenarios within the draft itself that could fall to you? And what does that mean? Colm, you like to talk about drafting from back to front. I think that is very important, and that's an element of how you build out these teams.
Yeah, and the one point you made there that I think I'll reiterate on the draft strategy part of it is I'm doing a lot of slow drafts at the moment at the FFPC, but I'm doing some with other co-managers. And one of the things that we're doing, I think, when you're trying to balance like what the other person wants and what you want as well. Me and Shawn try and do this, live on shows because we do it all the time. But looking at, the quarterback, we talked today about the quarterback window. Like, look at the quarterback you'll get and then the likely running back options you'll get in those tiers, and do the 1v1 or the 2v2, like Shawn mentioned there, when he takes those two defenses in this particular format, what that's going to be in those last three picks from and which players might be available. And it's been willing to pass it up in that round. But I do think that if you kind of say, well, these are the three likely quarterbacks that I can take here, and these are the three likely running backs, for example, or these wide receivers will be available. And then you just do like quarterback 10 along with, let's say, running back 40 versus the running back 34 versus the quarterback 17, and how that looks for your roster at the end of it. I think that's a good process as well to work through some of these picks and the decisions, because there's no point in being 3 rounds later and be like, well, that was a really bad decision that we went and took that particular player there because it hasn't worked out the way that maybe you hoped. But that was a fun talk through the QB window. We'll do lots more quarterback window and zero RB talk over the course of the time up to the NFL season. But I felt that was a pretty fun thought experiment to go through, just even for myself and Shawn, calibrating ahead of some of these drafts then that we go on to do together. But any final thoughts, Shawn, on the QB window zero RB, or are we going to save that for another day and wrap this one up?
Yeah, we'll save that for another day. But I would encourage listeners to think through the incentives that they have when they are looking at QB tactics for 2024, what that means, both in terms of what you have to do earlier and what you have to do later. Because if you are taking QBs in the window, they become hinge picks for you. They're in the middle of the draft for you there. Yeah. And you're kind of transitioning from the early round tactics to the late round tactics. So much of what you're trying to do is going to be based on how you have all of those scenarios set in your head. Part of the thing about the QB window that you want to make sure you emphasize is the creativity and the flexibility that you have to not get locked into specific QBs. I think that it's important. One of the things, Colm, that you and I do like to do, and it's going to always depend on how many drafts you're doing. If you're doing 300 or 400 drafts, then I do think you obviously want to have a little bit more diversification. But when we get into this QB window, having good balance across the guys who are available there can be very helpful. The way that you get that is to understand how you're building early and how you're building late. The intentionality of the early picks and the late picks, when you have that set up properly and when you've thought through it, it really amplifies the value of the QB window picks. And I think how well you execute those with precision as opposed to with panic or with a lack of the ability to get diversification and to get value. Because one of the things that the QB window should allow you to do is to get very strong values overall with your QB picks. I mean, you should come out of the best ball season at plus value relative to ADP, specifically at the QB position. Now, one of the things that Jake Bose has written about on the site is that that may have less value to you than having plus value at the other positions, right? And there are reasons why that would be the case. And yet it's still something that if you have it set up very nicely here to where you've created flexibility and then you have intentionality because you worked front to back and back to front, you're going to be able to get those QB values without feeling panicked or under pressure when you are on the clock.
Awesome stuff. So we will leave it there. Of course, if you are Looking to subscribe over at rotoviz.com, you can use the code RBRadio2024 at checkout. Get yourself a 10% discount off a 1-year NFL pass. There is a lot of content going up there at the moment. Shawn teased some of it earlier, but there is stuff I know on the way from Shawn as well up on the site. So make sure you are subscribed. You get access to all of the tools and all of the content up on the website and much, much more. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. You can check his work, as I mentioned, up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.